Before we get to the crime, before we get to the apartment, the duct tape, the bodies, the fingerprint that would eventually break everything open, I want you to understand the world this happened in. Because crimes don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in places. In times. In conditions that shaped the people involved, the victims, the killers, the investigators, the children left behind. And this crime happened in the Bronx. In 1993. If you know your American history, even casually, you know that those two words together carry a specific weight. The Bronx. The early 90s. Let me paint the picture. The Bronx had been in a state of crisis for nearly 2 decades by the time 1993 rolled around. It started in the 1970s, when a combination of urban policy failures, white flight, rising poverty, and predatory landlord practices turned entire neighborhoods into something that looked, in places, like a war zone. Buildings burned. Not by accident, but because landlords discovered it was cheaper to torch a property for insurance money than to maintain it for tenants who couldn't afford rising rents. Between 1970 and 1980, the South Bronx lost more than 300,000 residents. Whole city blocks were reduced to rubble. A famous moment from the 1977 World Series, broadcast on national television, showed cameras panning away from Yankee Stadium to smoke rising from fires less than a mile away. A sportscaster said something that became one of the most quoted lines in New York history: "The Bronx is burning." By the late 1980s and into the 90s, things were slowly, painfully beginning to stabilize in some areas of the Bronx. Community organizations were doing extraordinary work. Churches anchored neighborhoods. Families who had stayed through the worst years were rebuilding, block by block. But a new crisis had arrived. Crack cocaine. The crack epidemic hit New York City with a ferocity that is difficult to overstate if you didn't live through it. Beginning in the mid-1980s and roaring through the early 90s, crack transformed the economy of the streets, the nature of drug-related violence, and the daily reality of life in neighborhoods like Morris Heights, like Hunts Point, like the South Bronx. Crack was cheap. Crack was immediately addictive. Crack could be produced quickly and sold in small quantities, which meant the market for it was everywhere, and the competition to control that market was violent. The NYPD, in 1990, recorded 2,262 murders in New York City. 2,262 people killed in a single year. In a single city. To put that in perspective, in 2023, that number was 386. In 30 years, murder in New York City dropped by more than 80%. But in 1993, when Luis Guerrero and Danis Sime were alive, when their son was 3 years old and the worst thing he knew about the world was probably a scraped knee, the city was still deep inside that era of violence. And the Bronx was at the center of it. Morris Heights. It's a neighborhood most people outside the Bronx have never heard of. It sits in the western part of the borough, bordered by the Harlem River to the west and the Cross Bronx Expressway, one of the most congested highways in America, to the south. In 1993, Morris Heights was a working-class community, predominantly Latino, heavily Dominican and Puerto Rican, with deep roots and deep community ties. The kind of neighborhood where everyone on a block knows everyone else's grandmother. Where kids play outside until the streetlights come on. Where the smell of cooking comes through every window in the evenings. It was also, like many neighborhoods in that era, navigating the tension between that community warmth and the street-level economy of drugs that had established itself in the surrounding areas. This is important, and I want to be careful about how I say it. Because there's a lazy version of this story that treats Morris Heights in 1993 as simply a dangerous place full of dangerous people, and leaves it at that. That's not the truth. The truth is that most people in Morris Heights were exactly what the neighbors would later describe Luis and Danis as being: quiet, hardworking, private, getting through. The drug economy existed alongside that, not because the community embraced it, but because economic desperation and systemic neglect had created conditions where it flourished, and because the people who ran it were often embedded in the same social fabric as everyone else. Luis Guerrero was embedded in that world. He was 31 years old. Dominican American. Connected. Prosecutors would later describe him as a narcotic supplier, a man who moved drugs at a level above the street corner, who dealt in quantities that mattered. But here's what the neighbors remembered about him. Nice. Quiet. Never bothered anyone. People are complicated. Luis Guerrero was a drug dealer who was, to the people who lived near him, simply a man. A husband. A father. Someone who took his kid outside. Someone who nodded hello in the hallway. Danis Sime was 28 years old. His wife. The mother of their son. Whatever she knew or didn't know about Luis's work, the record doesn't say. What it says is that she was there, in that apartment building, in the life they had built together. And their son, their 3-year-old boy, was the center of that life. I want you to hold on to that image. A family. Complicated, yes. Imperfect, absolutely. But a family. A mother. A father. A child. Living in a neighborhood in the Bronx in the summer of 1993. Now. Let me tell you about the man who was watching them. William Antonio Solis was born in the Dominican Republic. We don't know exactly when he arrived in the United States. Court documents and press releases don't give us the full biography. What we know is that by 1993, he was in New York City. He was part of the same community networks that Luis Guerrero moved through. He knew the streets. He knew the players. He knew the economy. He used street names, La Vega and Vega, the kind of aliases that signal someone operating in the informal economy of the streets, someone who had a reputation, a presence, a role. Prosecutors allege that at some point before June 21, 1993, Solis and 2 other men began making a plan. The plan was about Luis Guerrero. It was about what Luis had. And it was about taking it. Now, I want to pause here, because this is one of those moments where the details matter. The plan, as prosecutors would later describe it, was for a robbery. A targeted, premeditated theft of narcotics from a man they knew to be a supplier. This was not random. This was not impulsive. This was a calculated decision, made by men who knew their target, knew his routine, and had chosen a specific method to approach him. A fake drug deal. They would arrange to buy from Luis. He would show up expecting a transaction. They would be waiting. And that, right there, is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about the psychology of what was about to happen. Because when you lure someone in under false pretenses, when you construct a deception that requires them to trust you in order to make them vulnerable, you have already decided that this person's safety doesn't matter. You've already made a moral choice. Everything that followed was downstream of that choice. The date was set. June 21, 1993. The longest day of the year. Across New York City that morning, Danis Sime woke up. Made breakfast, maybe. Took care of her son. Did the ordinary things that ordinary mornings require. She had no idea. She had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her family before the day was over. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles into a place just before something terrible happens. Most people never notice it. They're going about their day, making plans, thinking about dinner, checking the time. The quiet is there, but it's invisible. It only becomes visible in retrospect. When you look back at the last ordinary moment and realize, that was the last time everything was normal. For Luis Guerrero, that moment may have been the drive over he believed he was going to make a sale. 2 kilograms of cocaine, a serious quantity, the kind of transaction that required trust between parties, the kind of deal you only do with people you feel reasonably sure about. We don't know if Solis and his associates had a prior relationship with Luis. We don't know whether Luis knew these men personally, or whether this was a new connection. What we know, from court documents, is that Luis showed up. He walked into that apartment expecting to walk out richer. What happened instead changed everything. The moment the door closed, the pretense ended. Solis and the two other men produced a weapon. They told Luis what was about to happen: follow instructions, or be shot. Luis Guerrero refused. Want to stop there for a moment, because that detail, that single act of resistance, is one of the most human things in this entire story. Here was a man faced with armed men, outnumbered 3-1, in an enclosed space with no obvious way out, and his first response was to refuse. Maybe he had faced down dangerous situations before and survived by projecting confidence. Maybe his instinct told him that compliance was more dangerous than defiance. Maybe he simply couldn't make himself surrender. We'll never know what went through his mind in that moment. What we know is what it cost him. All three men turned on him at once. It was not a fair fight. It was not a fight at all, really. It was three men overwhelming one. They wrestled Luis Guerrero to the ground. And then they bound him. Now here is a detail that prosecutors include in the court documents, and it's the kind of detail that stays with you. They didn't use handcuffs. They didn't use zip ties or rope or anything purpose-built for restraint. They used a wire hanger. And duct tape. A wire hanger. The kind that lives in every apartment closet in America. The kind that's so commonplace you stop seeing it. The kind that, in this context, tells you exactly what kind of operation this was. This was not a professional crew. This was not sophisticated. This was improvised, chaotic violence, men who had made a plan and were now, in the heat of the moment, using whatever was at hand to hold it together. They twisted that wire hanger around Luis Guerrero's wrists. They wrapped the duct tape over it. And they left him on the floor. But they weren't done. Because there was still the matter of Danis Sime. Danis Sime was outside. She and her 3-year-old son were waiting in a car while Luis went up to handle what she may have believed was just business. The kind of errand that takes a few minutes. The kind of thing where you tell your wife to wait and you'll be right back. She was waiting. One of the men, we don't know which one, the documents don't specify, left the apartment. He went downstairs. He approached the car. And he told Danis that she needed to come inside. What did he say to her? What reason did he give? Did he claim Luis had asked for her? Did he say something was wrong? Did he use some other pretense, something casual enough that she didn't panic, didn't run, didn't honk the horn and draw attention? We don't know. What we know is that Danis got out of that car. She brought her son with her. And she walked into the building. Think about that walk. From the car to the door. Up the stairs. Down a hallway. To an apartment where her husband was bound on the floor and 3 men were waiting. Every step she took was a step towards something she didn't understand yet. And every step she took, with her 3-year-old boy at her side, was ordinary. Just a woman and her child, walking through a building, going to find her husband. Until it wasn't. Inside that apartment, Danis was overpowered. She was bound with duct tape, the same roll, presumably, that had been used on Luis. Her hands secured. Her ability to fight, to run, to protect her child, gone. Now both of them were on the floor of that apartment. Husband and wife. Bound and helpless. Their child in the room. And then, according to court documents, in language so clinical it almost obscures the horror of what it describes, the men had a discussion. After a discussion about what to do, the defendant and his co-conspirators decided they had no choice but to kill Guerrero and Sime. Read that again. Decided they had no choice. That framing, no choice, is the kind of self-justifying logic that people use when they want to commit an act of violence and need a story they can tell themselves afterward. There is always a choice. The choice they made was to kill two bound, helpless people in front of their child because it was more convenient than any alternative. That is not no choice. That is a decision. Made deliberately. Made by men who had already decided that Luis and Danis's lives were worth less than their own convenience and safety. And William Solis, according to prosecutors, stepped into the leading role. Danis Sime was in the bedroom. She was on the floor. Bound. Unable to move. Whatever she was thinking in those final minutes, whether she was praying, bargaining, trying to speak to her child, trying to understand how a day that started so ordinarily had arrived at this, we will never know. William Solis shot her in the head. Then he walked into the living room. Luis Guerrero was there. He had been on that floor, bound, for how long at this point? Long enough to know that whatever was happening in the other room was the end of everything. Long enough, maybe, to have heard something that told him his wife was gone. Solis shot him in the head. The apartment went quiet. Outside, the city kept moving. Horns. Music. The ordinary machinery of a summer afternoon in the Bronx. Inside, two people who had woken up that morning with plans and a future and a child who needed them, were dead. And their 3-year-old son was still in that apartment. I have thought about this detail more than almost any other in this story. A 3-year-old child. In a room, or near a room, where this had just happened. At an age when children understand almost nothing of the world's abstractions but feel everything in their bodies. Fear. Confusion. The absence of comfort. The killers had not planned for this, it seems. Or if they had, the plan was simply to leave him. But instead, according to prosecutors, they took the boy with them. They loaded that child into a car. And they drove. Not out of the city. Not across a state line. They drove to another apartment, the actual home where Luis and Danis lived with their son. Because they weren't done taking. They ransacked that apartment. Looking for more drugs. More money. Whatever Luis might have stored there beyond what was at the first location. Think about what that child experienced in those hours. He had just been in a room, or near a room, where his parents were killed. He was in a car with the men who did it. He was carried through an apartment being torn apart by strangers looking for things that didn't belong to them. He was 3 years old. He had no language for any of it. No framework. No one to hold him and tell him everything was going to be okay, because the people who did that were gone. And then the men left. They left the boy alone in that apartment. And they drove away. William Solis, prosecutors believe, was among them. He drove south, eventually. But not that night. Not right away. For the next 18 months or so, the records suggest he remained in New York City, living with what he had done, moving through the same streets, the same community. Hiding the way people hide when they don't yet. No, they need to hide. Just by being ordinary. Meanwhile, the boy was alone. We don't know exactly how he got outside. Maybe he knew how to open the door. Maybe he had done it before. Toddlers have a way of getting through spaces adults think are secured. Maybe the door had been left unlocked by the men who ransacked the apartment. What we know is that at some point, after a night alone in that apartment, after whatever small, terrified hours he lived through in the dark, the boy found his way outside. He stood on the grass in front of the apartment complex. And he began to scream. A neighbor named Anton heard him. Anton came outside and found the boy, screaming, sobbing, shaking with the kind of grief that overwhelms a small body entirely. He was screaming, "Daddy, Daddy," Anton would later tell the New York Daily News. He was scared. Anton tried to talk to him. Tried to find out what had happened. Tried to get something coherent from a 3-year-old who had no coherent way to explain what he'd been through. And in pieces, in the broken, desperate language of a small child, the boy told Anton something. He said a man had pointed a gun at his mother. He said the man had put a cover over her head. He said, reaching for the only words he had, that El Otro had taken her away. El Otro. The other one. The one who didn't belong. The stranger. Anton called the police. The boy was taken in. Officers began asking questions, gently, carefully, because what do you ask a 3-year-old about the worst night of his life? And the answer, the terrible, inadequate answer, is that you ask whatever you can and you get whatever he's able to give. What the police didn't know yet, what no one knew yet, was where Luis and Danis were. Because the apartment where they'd been killed was not the family home. It was another location. And it would be nearly 24 hours before anyone entered that apartment and found what was waiting inside. 24 hours. While a 3-year-old boy sat in the custody of strangers. While the city moved around him. While somewhere across the Bronx, in a closed apartment, his parents lay exactly where they had fallen. When officers finally entered that apartment, when they found Luis Guerrero and Danis Sime, the scene confirmed everything the boy's fragmented account had suggested. Both victims shot in the head. Both still bound. The duct tape still on their wrists. The wire hanger. The drugs that hadn't already been taken, gone. And one other thing. Something that, at the time, meant very little. Something that wouldn't mean anything for more than 30 years. A fingerprint. Left behind on the duct tape by the person who wrapped it around a dying man's wrists. In 1993, that fingerprint was collected, catalogued, and filed. It matched nothing in the available databases. The case was opened. Let me tell you something about cold cases that most people don't fully understand. They don't go cold because nobody cares. They go cold because the system that's supposed to solve them is overwhelmed, underfunded, under-resourced, and operating in conditions that make sustained focus on a single case nearly impossible. In 1993, the NYPD was processing over 2,000 homicides a year in New York City. 2,000. Every one of those cases needed detectives. Every one needed interviews, evidence processing, witness canvassing, forensic analysis, court appearances, paperwork. And every new day brought new cases. The Guerrero Sime double homicide was opened immediately. Investigators worked it. They canvassed the neighborhood, which, as anyone familiar with street culture can tell you, is not always a straightforward process. In communities where trust in law enforcement is complicated by history, by immigration status, by fear of retaliation, witnesses often stay silent. Not because they don't care. But because speaking can carry its own consequences. Neighbors described Luis and Danis as good people. Quiet. Private. But connecting that general goodwill to specific, actionable information about who had been in that apartment on June 21st, that was a different thing entirely. The 3-year-old had given them fragments. A man with a gun. A cover over his mother's head. El Otro. From a child who was 3 years old. Who had been through something no child should survive. The fingerprint was catalogued and run through the available systems. In 1993, fingerprint database technology was nothing like what it is today. The FBI's National Fingerprint Database, AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, existed, but it was far less comprehensive than the modern version. Not everyone who had contact with the criminal justice system had their prints in the system. Not every state's records were fully integrated. And the technology for matching prints was slower, less precise, and required more manual verification. The fingerprint came back with no match. Which meant, in practical terms, that the most promising piece of physical evidence they had was, for now, useless. 1994 came. The case remained open, which, in official terms, means it was never abandoned. An open case is still an active case, technically. But practically, the line between an active case and a cold one is this: whether anyone is working it right now. By 1994, with no suspects identified, no witnesses willing to come forward, and a fingerprint that matched nothing, the Guerrero Sime investigation became, in practice, a cold case. A file in a cabinet. A family without answers. And William Solis? By the time investigators had reached that point, by the time the case was beginning to cool, Solis was preparing to leave. Prosecutors say he departed New York City approximately 18 months after the murders. Sometime in late 1994 or early 1995. He didn't flee in the dramatic sense that word sometimes implies. He didn't book a one-way ticket to a country with no extradition treaty. He didn't change his name or construct an elaborate false identity. He just moved south to Florida, to Tampa. And in Tampa, William Solis began the slow, quiet work of becoming someone unremarkable. Tampa, Florida. In the mid-1990s, Tampa was a mid-sized city on Florida's Gulf Coast, growing, warming, increasingly diverse, with a significant Caribbean and Latin American immigrant community. A city where a Dominican man from New York could arrive, find community, find work, find a rhythm. A city where, if you were careful and quiet and didn't draw attention to yourself, you could simply be a person. That is, apparently, what William Solis did. He built a life in Tampa. We don't have detailed information about that life, prosecutors haven't released a biography, and the legal proceedings are still ongoing. But the basic facts are these: he lived there. He stayed there. For 30 years, he stayed there. And in 2001, 8 years after the murders, he became a United States citizen. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 8 years after allegedly executing 2 people in a Bronx apartment, after binding a husband and a wife and shooting them in the head in front of their child, William Solis stood somewhere and raised his right hand and swore an oath of citizenship. Citizenship requires fingerprinting. It requires background checks. It requires, in theory, a clean record. And yet, there he was. William Antonio Solis, also known as La Vega, also known as Vegano, a United States citizen. How? The answer, most likely, is that he had never been charged with anything. There were no warrants in his name, at least not publicly available ones. The NYPD investigation had not produced a suspect. The fingerprint had matched nothing. From the perspective of the immigration and naturalization system, William Solis had no record. He was, officially, clean. And so he got his citizenship. And he kept living his life. And the filing cabinet in the Bronx stayed shut. 30 years is a long time for evidence to survive. Duct tape, stored properly in controlled conditions, can preserve fingerprints remarkably well. The oils and residues that form a fingerprint are protected by the adhesive, sealed in a sense, by the very material they were left on. That piece of duct tape, that ordinary household object that had been used in an act of extraordinary violence, had been sitting in storage since 1993. Waiting. And now, with better technology, with larger databases, with a dedicated team that refused to let the case stay forgotten, it was time to ask the question again. Whose fingerprint is this? While the Bronx case file sat in storage, while a boy grew up into a man without parents, while investigators with different tools and different eras tried to make sense of 30-year-old evidence, William Antonio Solis was living in Tampa. I want to spend some time on this, because I think it's one of the most psychologically complex parts of the entire story. What does it look like, from the outside, when a man who allegedly committed double murder simply goes on living? It looks like nothing. That's the answer. It looks like nothing at all. William Solis arrived in Tampa sometime around 1994 or 1995. He was in his early 30s, the same age Luis Guerrero had been when he died on the floor of that Bronx apartment. Tampa's demographics in that era were shifting, the city's Latin American and Caribbean population was growing, drawn by the warmer climate, by economic opportunity, by family networks that extended across the diaspora. For a Dominican man from New York, Tampa offered community, familiarity, a version of home in a new setting. He didn't arrive as a fugitive in the traditional sense. No one was publicly hunting him. There were no wanted posters with his name on them, or if there were, they were circulating in a limited way that didn't reach him or the people around him. He wasn't hiding from active pursuit. He was simply absent. Gone from New York. Present in Florida. Just a man who had moved. In Tampa, he used street names, La Vega and Vega. In 2003, the FBI's fingerprint database, the OFFIS, was fully integrated as a national system, connecting fingerprint records across all 50 states and federal agencies with a standardization that hadn't previously existed. Every year after that, the database grew. More records added. More reference prints from immigration, from arrests, from background checks. In 2013, the FBI launched NGI, the Next Generation Identification System, which improved matching accuracy dramatically. The algorithms got better. The ability to search latent prints found at crime scenes, against larger databases with greater precision expanded significantly. In 2018, the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, using genetic genealogy sent a signal through the cold case investigative community: the old limits no longer applied. Evidence that had seemed like a dead end for decades was now potentially a live lead. Cold case units across the country, emboldened by these developments and by growing public interest in unsolved crimes, began revisiting files that hadn't been opened in years. And somewhere in New York City, in the NYPD, in HSI, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, someone began looking at a double homicide from 1993 with fresh eyes. We don't have the internal investigative timeline. The government hasn't released it, and the ongoing prosecution makes it unlikely they will anytime soon. But here's what the court documents tell us: at some point, HSI New York's Violent Gang Task Force became involved in the case. This is a joint federal NYPD task force that targets serious violent crime, the kind of unit that brings federal resources to bear on cases that have exceeded what local investigators can handle alone. They began working the Guerrero Sime case. And they went back to the duct tape. The duct tape, wrapped around Luis Guerrero's wrists as he lay dying on the floor of that apartment, had been there all along. Investigators pulled it. They examined it with modern forensic techniques. There was a print. Clear enough to analyze. Clear enough to search. And in June 2025, 32 years after Luis Guerrero and Danis Sime were murdered, investigators ran that print through the modern AFIS database. The print matched William Antonio Solis, the man whose fingerprint was on the duct tape that had bound a dying man's wrists. The man who had lived in Tampa for 30 years. The man who had become a United States citizen 8 years after allegedly committing double murder. The man who was, as of June 2025, 61 years old and living what appeared, from the outside, to be an entirely ordinary life. His name was on the screen. And after 32 years, the case that had gone cold in a Bronx filing cabinet had just become the hottest active investigation in the Southern District of New York. Because knowing who did something and proving it in federal court are two entirely different things. And the last thing you want, when you finally, after 3 decades, identified the man you believe killed Luis Guerrero and Danis Sime, is to rush. To tip your hand. To do anything that might spook a 61-year-old man into disappearing again. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York began building a case. Federal charges, specifically, intentional killing while engaged in a narcotics conspiracy, were being drafted. HSI Tampa was brought in. Local Tampa law enforcement was coordinated with surveillance, verification, documentation, all of it moving carefully, methodically, beneath the surface. In Tampa, William Solis went about his life. Did he feel it? That invisible movement around him? That closing of distance? Did some instinct, the instinct that had kept him free for 30 years, send up any warning? We don't know. What we know is that on the morning of Wednesday, April 22, 2026, he was still there. In Tampa. Living his life. Not running. April 22, 2026. 32 years, 10 months, and 1 day after Luis Guerrero and Danis Sime were murdered in a Bronx apartment. It was a Wednesday. On that morning, in some configuration of vehicles and personnel that the government has not fully described publicly, federal agents and local law enforcement in Tampa were in position. HSI Tampa agents. Tampa Police Department officers. U.S. Customs and Border Protection personnel. All coordinated. All ready. All there for one person. William Antonio Solis, age 62. Also known as La Vega. Also known as Vegano. A Tampa, Florida resident. A United States citizen. The man whose fingerprint was on a piece of duct tape that had bound the wrists of Luis Guerrero as he died on the floor of a Bronx apartment in the summer of 1993. The arrest was made without incident. But William Antonio Solis was taken into federal custody on April 22, 2026, in Tampa, Florida. Without incident. Within hours, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York issued a press release. U.S. Attorney J. Clayton, whose office oversees federal prosecutions in Manhattan and, in this case, the Bronx, issued a statement. His words were brief. Measured. But they carried the weight of 33 years. For more than 30 years, this Bronx double murder has haunted a family and the people of New York. That ends today. HSI Acting Special Agent in Charge Michael Alfonso added, as alleged, William Solis spent decades hiding in plain sight more than 1,000 miles from where he viciously murdered the Guerreros in front of their young child. This arrest is the result of years of meticulous investigative work by dedicated special agents and task force officers who refused to let this case go cold. Refused to let this case go cold. William Antonio Solis appeared in federal court following his arrest. He is charged with intentional killing while engaged in a narcotics conspiracy, a federal charge arising from the circumstances of the murders, the planned robbery of a narcotics supplier, the killings that occurred during the course of that robbery. This is not a state murder charge. This is a federal charge, which means it is prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, not the Manhattan DA or the Bronx DA. Federal charges often carry different sentencing structures than state charges. In this case, the charge carries two possible sentences at the extreme end of the spectrum, life in prison. Or the death penalty. Actually pursue the death penalty, or whether the case will ultimately result in a plea agreement, a lesser sentence, or a full trial, none of that has been determined yet. Federal cases of this complexity often take years to move through the system. What we know now is that the charge is on the books. The arrest has been made. The process has begun. And a man who was free on April 21, 2026, was no longer free on April 22. Here is something I think about when I consider cold cases that finally break. And everything after this is something different. Beat that moment. For William Solis, it came on April 22, 2026. For Luis Guerrero's family, for the son who stood on that lawn screaming, it was the moment they had been waiting for since 1993. April 22, 2026. Tampa, Florida. 33 years, 10 months, and 1 day after the murders. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, I want to ask you one thing before you go. Leave a comment with the word "remember." Because that's what this channel is about. Not sensationalism. Not shock. Not the most graphic version of the worst moments in people's lives. It's about remembering the people who were lost. The families who waited. The investigators who didn't give up. And the cold cases that remind us, again and again, that time doesn't always protect the guilty. Sometimes it just delays the reckoning. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe. Every story on this channel is told the same way, with care, with respect for the people at the center of it, and with the belief that these lives deserved more than to be forgotten. And if you've been here a while, thank you for watching until the end. There are more stories like this one. Stories that sat cold for years. Decades. Stories that broke open because someone kept asking. I'll see you in the next one.